Welcome to RSA Conference 2021. My God, it's been a while. I've attended these things for the years, over 2 decades, and I wish I was there in person with you, but frankly, I'm not. So here we sit, and I have some news for you, specifically about threats facing the financial sector. My name is Tom Kellermann. I'm the head of cybersecurity strategy for VMware, and I'm also on the board of the newly created Cyber Investigations Advisory Board for the United States Secret Service. This is a presentation that's based on a report that I've written for the past 4 years entitled Modern Bank Heists. And what's most important about this presentation, I think, it's the perspective of 126 CISOs from around the world, roughly 48% from North America, about 34% from Europe, and the remainder from Asia. And what's most important here is that they're really expressing their true honesty in these interviews vis-a-vis not only what threats they're facing, what's keeping them up at night, but what their priorities are going to be in the coming year. We all think of the financial sector as the most secure sector in the world from cyber attack, and it is. But it's also dealing with the most robust adversaries in the world and the most sophisticated cybercrime cartels. Now, look, the FBI has already acknowledged this. There's been a 400% increase of cyber attacks. And many of these attacks are targeting payment systems in the financial sector because of the nature of the stimuluses, as well as the fact that many people are working from home. You have this robust dark web's arms bazaar, as we've seen over the past 8 months, specific to now the development of zero-day exploit code. We're seeing a renaissance in 0 days that's been exploding for the last 8 months and are being utilized against us. We're seeing rogue nation states actually develop cyber attack capabilities and treat their cyber criminals as patriotic national assets and using them to offset economic sanctions. Because of telework, we're seeing a true failure of perimeter defense and encryption and the lack of visibility on those endpoints. We also have the phenomenon that these adversaries know much more about the interdependencies in the financial sector than they ever have before, and thus pursue campaigns of supply chain attacks or island hopping. And then you have the nature of the cybercrime cartels themselves. So offense must inform defense. And frankly, what we need to do here is really create a knight's fork on the board in order to kill their queen. And in order to kill the queen, we need to understand what that queen is. And from my perspective, that queen is that secondary C2 on a sleep cycle. How do we make sure that we've eradicated their footprint and their persistence within our infrastructures as we attempt to defend against an adversary who's become much more punitive? So there's been a fundamental restructuring of cybercrime cartels. Due to the pandemic, traditional crime was hurt. They couldn't actually move narcotics. They couldn't actually leverage human trafficking. And they had to migrate online, which really empowered the cybercrime syndicates of Eastern Europe to not only endow capabilities like ransomware as a service, but access mining services as well to traditional criminals. Whereas cybercrime cartels used to be the second-class citizens to the traditional organized crime syndicates, they themselves are now more powerful than those entities because of the trillions of dollars a year they steal from the Western world. So the top types of malware affecting the financial sector, yes, Emotet, yes, that takedown was impressive. God bless the Dutch and the coordination between the Dutch and the US and technology companies of the world to take down Emotet. But let's not pretend that Emotet is dead. We will see a resurrection of Emotet in the coming weeks. Then you've got Valeria, Dridex, Qbot, and Hansator. I think Dridex and the resurgence of Dridex is interesting. This was an attack code that I long thought was dead, that manipulates and misuses macros, but I think it's seeing a resurgence due to the nature of SaaS and SaaS being employed in most corporations due to the pandemic. 57% noted an increase in wire transfer fraud. And that's the frequency of wire transfer fraud, not necessarily the amount. And that's quite significant, but we see the North Koreans getting in the game, the Iranians getting in the game, and other organized crime syndicates beyond the Russians actually targeting payment systems, realizing the vulnerabilities of SWIFT and the over-reliance on public key infrastructure for security in that environment. 41% experienced an increase of brokerage account takeover. I would have thought this number would be larger, but it's just the way of the world. And many people are transacting online, and many of these cyber criminals are becoming much more savvy as it relates to affecting brokerage fraud and manipulating financial fraud schemes. As illustrated by this stunning fact, 51% experienced attacks that were targeting market strategies or non-public market information, where you see a persistent presence on, let's say, a portfolio manager's machine, or the head of strategy for the institution, market strategy for that institution's computer has been popped, and the adversary is watching what they're doing prior to taking major positions on the international markets. This type of digital front running and digital insider trading is very concerning to me, as the criminals of the world and these cybercrime cartels are well aware that the most valuable asset of a financial institution is not actually the capital, but it's the non-public market information itself. Now, in this question here, I said, please exclude SolarWinds, because SolarWinds is the prototypical island hop. I said, excluding SolarWinds, how many of you have seen the adversary attempt to commandeer your digital infrastructure and use it for island hopping? 38% noted that they had seen the adversaries attempt to commandeer their digital infrastructure and their digital transformation and use it to attack their customer sets. Now, this manifests in three ways. You've got network-based island hopping, much as we saw with SolarWinds. You've got watering hole attacks that are not limited to the websites being corrupted and commandeered, but more importantly, mobile applications and payment applications themselves. And then you've got this very Russian technique called reverse business email compromise, where they take over the O365 environment within that corporation or financial institution, and they push fileless malware against the executives in the organization, as well as the board of directors, specific to previous conversations that were had. The way they achieve that is they use narrow-based machine learning to understand the syntax and the communications between those folks over the past month. And then they push fileless malware, typically macro-enabled, to target those entities so that they can move further into those ecosystems and then use those accounts to target everyone who trusts them. And this is really the Achilles heel of the financial sector. Look, the financial sector is based on trust and confidence in the safety and soundness of your assets. And for too long, I think there's been this focus on safety and soundness and insufficient focus on trust and confidence, because it's that trust and confidence that's being used against them as we see these attacks leveraging their own infrastructures to target their customers and their employees. Now, notably, 54% experienced destructive attack, but this is 118% increase year over year. This just demonstrates the punitive nature and how the heist has become a hostage situation where the adversary is willing to become destructive in that environment. Whether that's due to geopolitical tension or counter-incident response is unbeknownst to me, but I would say that in forms of destructive attacks, you've got pure wipers. You've got denial of service, distributed denial of service just to punish the victim. You've got the repurposing of ransomware to be used as wipers, much like NotPetya style attacks. You've got specific and very tactical deletion of critical data and backups. And then you've got hybrid attacks against OT and infrastructure associated with those facilities. Counter-incident response is actually occurring 63% of the time. They are fighting back to maintain persistence. This is no longer your Dillinger gang. This is more like the Joker. They are ensuring that they maintain persistence. They are fighting back. They are leveraging destructive attacks. They're deleting logs. They're manipulating timestamps. And most importantly, they understand truly that time is the utmost important asset and variable in those transactions and for defense. 41% observe the manipulation of timestamps. This is highly problematic. Timestamps were being used to not only affect how people responded to incidents, but in many cases, it could be believed that they were used to manipulate the value of currency or the value of a trade. There are 9 manifestations of counter-incident response. You've got blocking events from hitting the SIM. You've got disabling AMSI or other security tools. You've got clearing logs, manipulating timestamps. You've got using alternative authentication material like pass the hash. You've got signed binary proxy execution like lol bins, using legit files to execute untrusted code, deploying ransomware NotPetya style, and deploying wipers as final stages of destruction, of where that really becomes a hostage situation. And we really need to be very concerned about those manifestations 8 and 9. We don't want it to escalate to that level. 33% stated that Russia posed the greatest concern to them, followed by China, followed by the American underground, followed by the North Koreans, and followed by the Brazilian underground. And this makes sense. Look, the Russians have been incredibly active. The Russian cybercrime cartels have a pax mafioso with the regime, where they can insulate themselves and remain untouchable from Western law enforcement as long as they pay homage to the regime. You see collusion in major APT groups like 28 and 29 and Turla, who actually have cyber criminals who are members of those groups. And you have to respect that. You have to respect not only the sophistication and the organization of these Russian-speaking adversaries, but more importantly, the subculture itself and the nature in which they are studying us. They are studying us like a chess master. They understand how we defend, how we react when we're being attacked, and they are manipulating ourselves in the same vein. According to the 126 CISOs that were spoken to, their cybersecurity investment priorities are the following: XDR and the true manifestation of zero trust, contextual threat intelligence specific to threat actors, regions, and the sector, workload security, and container security. 48% of these financial institutions were conducting weekly threat hunts. That is dramatically up from last year, and I'm very happy to see that. Weekly threat hunts, I think, are an imperative. It's still less than 50%, but obviously not all institutions are equal when they realize that brand confidence and the long-term safety and soundness and trust and confidence in their organization will be based on them eradicating a threat before it manifests. Now, there is a true wheel of pain here for defenders, okay? Particularly a large institution that's operating internationally. You've got a detection challenge when you're dealing with 0 days as well as custom malware. You've got an investigation challenge where you're not sure how far they got, how far they went, and most importantly, how many C2s on sleep cycle might exist, let's say through steganography or something else. You've got an incident response challenge where basically you don't want the adversary to be aware that you're hunting them or trying to eradicate them from the systems because you don't want it to escalate to a destructive situation. And you don't necessarily want your infrastructure targeting your customers or your partners. And so you must become very clandestine in how you respond. You've got a time challenge, right? You got to decrease the amount of time that they can move laterally, exfiltrate sensitive data, and or leverage destructive attacks. And then you've got this distributed enterprise challenge where these once very secure networks are now distributed due to the pandemic and due to the nature of telework. Now, look, given the type of adversary that we're facing, given the fact that they're more likely to be punitive and escalate the situation, we really need to create a new best practice for threat hunting. When discussing an intrusion, set up a secure communications channel like Signal, not Slack, not Teams, please. They are monitoring all of those things. They are omniscient to all of those things. Use something like Signal or Wicker to communicate when discussing an intrusion. Assume that they have a secondary C2 on a sleep cycle. Just assume it. The people that are targeting the banks of the world are the best of the best. Typically, they love to deploy a C2 that has a 12 to 14 day sleep cycle, many times in steganography. You got to combat alert fatigue because typically all the bells and whistles are going to be going off. So how are you going to baseline your organization for when these things do manifest? Do you have the capacity to detect and respond across workloads? And have you truly segmented personal and professional networks in the home environments of your executives and even your security teams as they're attempting to solve these things remotely? Now, look, I think one of the biggest challenges we face, even in the financial sector, which has the most significant standards of the world for cybersecurity, whether it's the Monetary Authority of Singapore or whether it's the FFIEC, these are the best of breed standards for information security and cyber. But that being said, they're very much based on a fortification. And I would attest to the fact that we have to change the way we think about this. The goal of the adversary is to conduct a hostage situation. The goal of the adversary is to use the infrastructure of the institution to target their constituencies, period. So I think we really need to begin to develop something that looks a lot more like a Supermax prison, which exists here in Colorado, where I live, much like that of the Supermax, the original Supermax, and that of the Perfect Castle. And I say that for the following reasons. When you think about the original development of the Supermax prison, it was developed by not only the best prison architects in 1991 and 92, but also some very significant social psychologists and cognitive psychologists, of which they were advising these architects on the mentality of the greatest sociopaths, of the megalomaniacs that were locked up in the worst prisons of the world. And they were discussing how these criminals typically took over that prison from the inside out. They were running the guards, they were running criminal conspiracies and even hits against the outside world from within the prisons. And they had to inhibit that cult of personality from manifesting within that environment. That's what we should be trying to achieve when it relates to dealing with the cyber criminal and cybercrime cartel as they target financial institutions. Okay, you need to limit and inhibit them from a resource perspective. You need to inhibit lateral movement. You need to make sure you suppress them in real time. You need to make sure that the infrastructure intrinsically defends itself against them, and that when you hunt them and when you're responding to them, they are unaware that you are doing so. So to achieve that, I really It begins with having network detection and response capabilities, but those have to be intertwined with workload security. And then as you move further on, the endpoint protection platform has to be seamlessly integrated to both of those aspects. And then finally, the network segmentation should be dynamic, specific to threats from either the network or the endpoint to that environment. Applying rules like zero trust are fundamental, but intrinsically powering them by integrating these types of capabilities will be fundamental to your success. In order to achieve, intrinsic security and zero trust, you have to believe in the construct of intrusion suppression. Intrusion suppression, in its very definition, is the construct of can you detect, deceive, divert, contain, and hunt an adversary, unbeknownst to an adversary. And I believe firmly that to achieve that, you need to conduct weekly threat hunts, which really give you game day film. You need to integrate your NDR with your EPP. You need to audit current system state. You need to segment your network. And if you can dynamically do so specific to contextual threat intelligence, that's powerful. You need to deploy application control because frankly, it's really hard to get underneath that. You need to apply just-in-time administration, deploy workload security, and use deception technology where you see attack paths that you cannot harden. So at a minimum, you can alert and respond to the adversary of today. We just need to remember, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was to convince the world he didn't exist. And that devil, my friends, is somewhere in your infrastructure, and it's your job to root it out. And all I got to say is happy hunting. And thank you for allowing me to speak to you today. My name is Tom Kellermann from VMware.